Hi, Jeremy Cordeaux in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycordeaux.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.
Hello and welcome to Sundoku, the podcast for addicted readers. It's Sarah here, and today I'm bringing you a Minisode, which, if I'm honest, it's not so mini. It's a little indulgent, but I've been trying to get time with the author Pip Williams for so long. She's the author of the Dictionary of Lost Words, which is a phenomenon, bestseller. It's also been turned into a theatre production by the State Theatre Company of South Australia and is optioned to be a mini-series. It's cut through so many ways, and it's because of its amazing writing, great concept, you name it. If you haven't read it yet, what are you doing? If you have, you know what I'm talking about. Anyway, Pip's second novel, The Bookbinder of Jericho, is just as captivating, set in a similar time, also around the Oxford University Press. It's a companion piece to the Dictionary of Lost Words, again telling the stories of women and their experiences through that time. So it was fabulous to get to sit down with Pip at her home in the Adelaide Hills and talk to her about just what it is that makes her writing tick, what it is that inspires her, and it is a fascinating conversation. And I'll just let you know, I started off by asking Pip what started her relationship with words.
It's complicated, which is often the case, I think. So I'm dyslexic. Actually, my original relationship with words was unproblematic because I was a child and I didn't care really what my words looked like. I just cared that I could use them to compose sentences that helped me to express the way I felt or what I thought about something. I have loads of little notebooks full of poetry about nuclear disaster, love and family. And, you know, all of those words were carelessly and thoughtlessly used. And then, of course, it started to matter that those words weren't spelt properly, they didn't look great, they were messy. I have to admit, though, that even though that was the case, my dyslexia was obvious, I suppose, early on, I actually still had so much support around me. So my parents, for instance, other than giving me quite a few dictionaries as birthday presents, they didn't chastise me for the poor spelling or the poor writing. Instead, just focused on what I wrote and the ideas I was expressing and the emotion I was expressing. And so I got a lot of positive feedback for putting words on paper, even though they looked incorrect. I got negative feedback to some extent at school, but even then I had teachers, particularly in later high school, because it wasn't until I was actually in year 11 that a teacher told my parents that I was dyslexic, and that explained so much, like this disparity between my conversation in class and my clear understanding of something and then my poor written work. So she started to give me oral tests and quiz me about what I understood, and she would combine that with my written work. And because I'd had so much encouragement, thankfully, I was already in the habit of using words to express myself. As a child, though, you don't do it always for any kind of praise or accolades. I literally was doing it to express myself and to understand the world. As you get older, writing, drawing, music, performing of any kind tends to be something that you're expected to share. And although I really loved doing it, it never occurred to me that I could be the kind of writer that's shared. With one exception, I did send a poem into Dolly magazine when I was 15.
Oh, Dolly.
with women of a certain age, that usually gets such a great response.
I'm with you.
Yeah. And I was lucky enough to have that published. And it was one of those poems. It was called 15, and I could recite the first few lines.
Can you?
Yeah. It started, I am so embarrassed. It rhymes, which is the first point of embarrassment. It goes, 15 is an age of just in between. No immature habits should ever be seen. No alcohol served at your table at night. Don't act like a child. You're in adult sight. Something like that.
Oh, that's amazing.
And it's all about that, being in this kind of liminal space between childhood and adulthood. And it was in response to being told I wasn't allowed to go out. And yet I was expected to behave like an adult, but I wasn't being treated like one. So it was kind of a protest poem. And I sent it off to Dolly without any expectations and was absolutely thrilled that it got published. But that was the beginning and the end of my brilliant career as a writer. I had no role models for writing at that point in my life, and there was no writing courses to do in the 80s. Yeah, so that wasn't an option for me, so I went on and did other things. But writing and words stuck with me. I continued to use them for my own personal pleasure, but eventually the desire to write as a vocation took over my life, literally in that I became depressed that I wasn't writing. I wasn't satisfied with the work I was doing, which was great work. I loved what I used to do, but it became less and less satisfying.
Given that you had that personal drive and it felt like a loss that you didn't have writing in your life.
Beautifully said, yeah.
Was it then just a matter of how do I functionally make this happen so that I can fit this writing that I need to do into my life?
Yes, largely. So I'm a planner by nature, planner eventually by trade. I was a community planner. That was my last job. I can't help but think ahead. And so a long time ago, I started to realise that I needed to have writing in my life. And there's this period of contemplation, you know, with anything, where you contemplate something for a certain amount of time, and that's a natural part of taking on a new hobby or a new habit, whatever it might be. You contemplate it for ages. We do this with exercise and dieting and all sorts of things. And so I contemplated writing for far longer than I should have, because it's that sort of prolonged contemplation which turned into a kind of depression, because all I was doing was thinking about it. I wasn't doing it at all. One of the reasons I wasn't doing it was because I was a research academic and I spent all day thinking and writing. And I just didn't have the mental strength to think and write when I got home. And I also had 2 small children and et cetera, et cetera. And so over many, many years, I started to pull back on work. I used the children as an excuse, but really it was all about the writing. I worked 4 days a week and then 3 days a week. And I remember having a conversation with my boss. I used to work at the Centre for Work and Life with Barbara Pocock, actually, who's now a Greens senator. And I remember her having a conversation with me about my future because she had ideas that perhaps I would be the kind of ambitious academic that you normally find at a university and would one day want to, step into her shoes, into a bigger leadership role. And I said to her, Barb, every time I get a pay rise, I'm going to take that much time off my working life. I need this much money to survive, and time is worth so much more to me than money at a certain point. And my desire would be to pull back on work every time my income allows it. And she was so supportive. And in fact, she's the one that came up with this idea that sometimes, particularly around creative things, the creativity we all have as a child, many of us suppress it as we go into adulthood and take on kind of adult roles. But after a while, if it's a genuine part of who you are, that creativity will come knocking. And at first the knock is very gentle, and it gets louder and louder over the years if you refuse to answer the door to it. And this was her metaphor, but I use it all the time. And that's what happened. writing came knocking, and it got so loud that I had to open the door to it. And I did that over a number of years by pulling back on work. In fact, I left academia partly so that I could free up the space in my mind to write creatively. And that's when it started. As soon as I left academia, I was able to write.
It takes a lot of guts to believe in your passion to the point where you withdraw from traditional life, you know, in terms of the go to work, get the job done. And also as a mother, as a partner, as a functioning human, the lists that we keep in our heads are beyond belief.
Oh, and I'm a list maker, so I can't, you cannot overstate the length of my list.
When we talk mental load, trying to add something that, as enjoyable as it is, it's another job, and make it creative, it does take the guts to be able to go, no, I need to carve time for this and commit time. How much time do you give yourself now for the creative process?
Now I'm so lucky I write full time. And when I say that, don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I don't write 8 hours a day, but I don't have another job. So my job now is writing, and that has been possible since the publication of the Dictionary of Lost Words. But up until the publication of that book, I was working and writing. So I wrote a memoir called One Italian Summer while I was working at the City of Adelaide as a community planner there. And that took, a number of years. And the job I had at that point was 4 days, then 3 days, then 2.5 days. So I literally kept stepping down whenever I could. And then when that book was published, I started writing the Dictionary of Lost Words. And that was probably the bravest thing I've ever done. It wasn't stepping back from work, it was starting that book. And I can talk about that later. But when I was writing that book, I was working as a consultant community planner. And that's a nice story because I suppose this was commitment to what I had always wanted to do, which was write. When I went for that job, it was with this wonderful company called URPS, Urban and Rural Planning Solutions. I went for that job and I said to them, I'd really love to work here because I really love being a community planner. I like to contribute, but writing is the most important thing in my life. And if the job gets in the way of my writing, I'll choose the writing. And I said this at my interview.
Well done.
And it was one of those things where you have to think to yourself, I have to be willing to lose this. And they were amazing. They said, okay, we understand. I worked there for over 2 years, I think, and I was writing dictionary the whole time. And there were times when I needed to go on retreat or I needed to spend some time doing research, actually, going to the UK. And at every turn, they supported the extra time I needed off because, the research trip would take a little extra time or whatever. They were so supportive. And they were true to that kind of commitment at the interview, which was fantastic because, it does two things. I really appreciated that support and I treated the job with the greatest respect. But it also meant, for me personally, wow, these are complete strangers and they value my writing. And not because of the writing itself, but because they recognise that it's valuable to me. There was something about that was, very heartening. I don't think that actually would happen in many places, but it was fantastic for me because it meant that I really could focus on this project because people were backing it, not just me. They didn't know really what I was writing about. I don't think they cared. And honestly, whenever I said to anybody I was writing about a dictionary, their eyes just glazed over, which is what I mean by that was the bravest thing I've ever done is sort of decide, I'm going to write a novel about a dictionary.
I just think your commitment to backing yourself and being upfront it's such a credit to you because, I don't know, I have this theory that if everyone wore their hearts on their sleeves a little more, everyone would perhaps accommodate one another a little more. If we actually just said, this is what I'm passionate about in my life, and we're upfront, It's like, I love this, but, this is the thing that drives me and lights my candle and keeps me going.
That's right. And if the candle is lit, it sheds light on other parts of your life. And that's the thing. And I think they probably understood that if I was happy and passionate and engaged with something, that would spill over into my work. And it did, I think. Whereas when I was suppressing the creative urge, my work suffered, because there was some kind of competition between the two. And, that did crazy things to the way I thought about work. So, yeah, I'm sure someone smarter than me can kind of work out what was going on there, but it did sort of work out okay for me.
Bravery of writing about a dictionary. How did that come to you? Where were you in the moment that it struck you that story was going to have power?
Well, you're sitting in the chair I was probably sitting in when I had the idea when I had the idea for that book. So I had read The Surgeon of Crowthorne by Simon Winchester, which is a really gorgeous, pithy little bit of non-fiction about the relationship between the editor of the Oxford English Dictionary and one of the people who sent in words with examples of how they'd been used in a book. And this is how the dictionary came to be, actually. I think of it as the first crowdsourced project, because James Murray, the editor, essentially sent out a call for people around the world to send in words and examples of how they'd been used in whatever books they happened to have on their shelf. And so they would compile those and create definitions. And so this book, The Surgeon of Crowthorne, was about one man who did that. It's very interesting. Go and read it. But by the end of it, the thing that I was left with was an understanding of how the dictionary had been made, how a word got into the dictionary. And the way a word got into the dictionary, then as in now, is it has to have been written down. And then I just did some calculations. I was a social scientist for a really long time, and so I suppose I've been taught to be a critical thinker and to look at where the data comes from. So whenever I hear about anything, I'm like, yes, but where does the data come from?
Follow the numbers,
follow
the info.
That's how I assess the validity of a statement. And so in the same way, I ask myself, well, hang on a minute, if a word has to be written down, and the dictionary was a project that was started in the 1850s, finished in 1928, it's a Victorian era project. Most of the books, most of the words that had been written down up until that point had been written down by men, and not just any old men with a certain level of education. And I realised that the data set was flawed, essentially, because it was biased towards the experience of one group of people, and the language serves many groups of people. And English in particular serves many groups of people, not just men and women, not just middle, upper and lower classes, but colonised countries. English is the main language, the official language of so many countries who actually speak other languages, and yet the definitions for these words were essentially being defined based on the words that have been written down by, educated white men. Surprise, surprise.
And never heard that story before.
No. and so that was just a curiosity. I had no intention. I didn't immediately think, I'll write a novel about that. In fact, complete opposite. I just Googled, are there particular words that only women used at a certain time? And I just couldn't find the answers. And eventually, over probably a couple of months, I thought, well, one way to explore this would be to put a little girl under the sorting table where all the words of the English language are being defined, and imagine how those words might affect her and how she might affect the words as she grows into a woman. And that's where the story started.
Brave, yes, but necessary also, I feel, over the last many years, but, recently there's been so much interrogation of where stories come from in truth-telling around Indigenous cultures and colonisation, in the worlds of women. So exploring this in what is a curious, gentle way is just exceptional. Bringing that through fiction, I think that's why it cuts through so hard, is because women love seeing their stories told, for one thing. Thank you. But also because it's through the eyes of a child growing up curious, and that protagonist allows you a lot of freedom for exploration and adventure, doesn't it?
It does. And there's so many gaps, not just in the history but in the archives, that for a novelist I can write into those gaps. And, you know, it's fiction, of course, though that book and The Bookbinder of Jericho are both, I suppose, hanging off a scaffold of history. And I don't change the history as I know it to be true. So all I'm doing really is I'm fictionalising the stories that have always been woven through history but never recorded or saved because they weren't considered valuable enough to record or save. And the reason I use the word save is because I've spent a lot of time in archives, and I know that archives, just like history books, have on the whole been the domain of men. Archives hold what the archivist considers valuable or the archivist's boss considers valuable. And not now, but previously, those things that were considered valuable were men's experiences. And so when I was in the archives, I often found very little about the women I was interested in. And that was the case with The Bookbinder of Jericho. You know, I wanted to find out about the women who bound the books. But all the archivist could find, and he was a wonderful archivist, he considers far more varied things valuable now. But the archivists before him, while they'd kept boxes and boxes and boxes of information about all the men and the jobs that they did, there was very little about the 100 women that worked at the press, mostly as bindery girls, which is what they were referred to. There were a few photographs. There was a little bit of film footage.
Now, I've seen this.
Yeah.
And because I read your words before I saw it, I'd closed my eyes so many times and tried to imagine this process.
Yeah, of binding a book.
Oh my, just watching it, it's like a dance. It's magic. You know, their hands move so fast, their bodies move so fast.
They are so fast. They're like machines. And the film is so interesting. It's this gorgeous black and white film with black and white film music going over it and, signage coming up to tell you what's coming up next. I saw this woman gathering sections onto her arm, and she was so beautifully dressed. I have a feeling she had a heads up that there was going to be filming that day, because she's wearing high heels and she's just not wearing an apron, and they did all wear aprons. But her movements are so elegant and yet so fast and efficient. And it is like a dance. And I wondered to myself as I saw that footage, because I was there looking for some information about the women who worked in the bindery for the Dictionary of Lost Words. And I saw this footage and I just thought to myself, I wonder what she's gathering. I wonder what the book is that she's gathering into her arms. And then I thought, I wonder if she ever stops to read what she's binding, what she's folding or gathering or sewing. Does she ever stop to read the words? And suddenly I had a character, because I had someone who wanted something, someone who wanted to read. And yet I knew that if she did stop to read, someone would come over, a supervisor. Let's call her Mrs. Hogg.
Oh, yes.
She would come over and she'd say, your job is to bind the books, not read them. And, that was just a story. And I had the idea for that story before I'd even finished Dictionary. So it was quite nice for me to sort of have that in my little holding pen.
Waiting in the wings.
Waiting in the wings while I finished off Dictionary.
I want to come back to this, but what I also just want to know is this process of research for you. Do you do all your research up front and then write, or do you write and then say, oh, I need to know more about this particular aspect, so I need to return to the source?
Yeah, a bit of both. So I for both of these books, I do enough reading so that I have a really good grasp of the context. So context is place, the historical moment, what was important at that time, and more specific context for the first book, what was the timeline of the dictionary, who were the main people, and for Bookbinder of Jericho, again, who were the main people at Oxford University Press. What I was really interested in too is what were some of the key books that were published and printed in that place at that time that I'm interested in, which was World War One. Mm-hmm. Once I've got that context, that's my scaffold, I suppose. That's when I turn to the characters to tell me what it is I need to know. And I guess I've come to this over 2 books. What I realise is that I have to leave it up to the characters. I have to leave that additional research up to the characters. If I don't, if I sort of come across some interesting fact from that time or place and I try to shoehorn it into Peggy's story or Esme's story, it won't fit. It will stick out. It's irrelevant often to their life. And so, the research I do simultaneously with the writing of the story, because it's constantly, I suppose, a response to something that the character has done or needs or is thinking about. Right down to things like, my character is making a coffee in the morning. I decided Peggy liked coffee and she makes coffee. Suddenly I have to go and research, how did they make coffee, in 1914?
Yes,
and
in a boat.
Exactly, on a narrow, boat where they don't have running water. And so that will send me off to do some research. And the research then gives me just as much information as I need to write that scene with some authenticity. But I wouldn't have gone looking for how do they make coffee in 1914 unless Peggy told me to, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I would imagine that stops you from being almost buried under the avalanche of knowledge, because if you know too much, your brain sort of starts going, you've got to put this. This is something I found. It's jostling for your attention, I feel.
That's right. And there's still bits of that because the general research I do is pretty thorough. So there are always interesting historical facts, moments, people that I wonder if I can use. You do all of this research and I can't tell you how many notes I take. I have so many notebooks, copious amounts of notes. I cut and paste things into my notebooks. But there's very little that I go back to. And this thing that somebody else said was you do all of this research and essentially some of it rises to the top, like the cream rises to the top, and that's what you remember, and it's what you remember that ends up in the book. And if you remember it, you're remembering it because it was interesting or it was vital to your story, it was relevant in some way. If you don't remember it, it's because it wasn't interesting. And if you don't find it interesting enough to recall, then it probably won't be interesting enough for the reader. There are exceptions to that because, there are things you just want to get right. So I go back to my notes to make sure, have I got the right date, et cetera, et cetera. But on the whole, you do the research so that you've got this foundation of knowledge, but you don't put all of that in. It just makes you feel safe.
That's such a good process though. And freeing yourself to know that you've got the data, but you know the gems and you can go ahead and fly from there is, that's quite nice.
And for me as a social scientist, there's a freedom in not having to refer to my original sources constantly and reference everything and be absolutely certain that I've got it 100%. That's part of the joy of, I suppose, writing historical fiction and not history.
100%.
Yeah.
I'm going to focus mostly on Bookbinder of Jericho. Yeah. It's such a beautiful companion piece, how it crosses over from dictionary. I love that you've gone from who has power over words to who has power to access and use words and use knowledge. And that to me was such a great turning point that you then sort of explored Peggy's and the bindery girl's life, the town girl's life. and what that meant, how they could and couldn't open doors.
Literally and metaphorically.
But set in the spectre of the war, when the lives of women are changing so significantly, it just gives those opportunities for perhaps those doors to be left ajar enough for us to sneak through. Do you feel like a character like Peggy could have done all that in the real world?
Yes. Yes, and I know that because this is one of those little bits of history that I didn't include. So I tried to represent Somerville College as honestly as I possibly could. I was given access to their archives and their library. I know, amazing. And I have a lot of respect for Somerville College of 100 years ago, 150 years ago almost. Because Somerville College, unlike some of the other women's colleges at Oxford, so I think there were 3 or 4 women's colleges at that time, Somerville was unique in that it was secular, so it wasn't associated with a church. In fact, they didn't have a chapel there for, particularly during the time I wrote during World War I. To the extent that anyone was at that time, they were also very interested in giving access to education beyond the elite. Now, they didn't succeed particularly in doing that, but they did have sort of bursaries for textile workers. So not for, bindery women, but they did provide bursaries for working women and working class women. And so I know that there were limited avenues for some women from the working class to find a way into Oxford University. But it was so rare for that to happen. It was quite rare for women of middle and upper classes to get into university at this time. And we know that too because of Vera Brittain's wonderful memoir, Testament of Youth. So she was an upper middle class woman. Her father actually owned the paper mill that made the paper for Oxford University Press. And so she has a little cameo in the Bookbinder of Jericho because I couldn't have written either of these books without her memoir, essentially, which says something because there is in some ways so little evidence of women throughout history that I just valued this one memoir so much because it's one of very, very few memoirs of women's experience of World War I. And so Vera Brittain had a lot of trouble going to Oxford University because it was just considered unnecessary for her to go as a woman, even though her brother could go. And she was far more, I suppose, academically inclined than her brother, but it was expected he would go and it was not expected at all that she would. And she had to really fight for it. And so for a woman like Peggy, who not only is a woman, and so there's the gender barrier, but she's working class. She hasn't got the money to attend university because how would that be supported? She hasn't got any expectation that she'd go to university, let alone high school, and so on, So while it was possible that a woman at that time in Peggy's situation could end up at university, it was extremely rare. And I think we have examples of that today, which is, for me, writing historical fiction and reading it is most exciting when I can reflect on the history and how it might speak to the present. And there are many groups of people in Australia who still don't have easy access to tertiary education because of their family, cultural, economic background. And we kid ourselves if we think we have equal access to everybody. We just don't, because expectation plays so much of a role in access to knowledge and access to opportunity. And so there's lots of groups who simply are not expected either by their family, their community, or larger society to succeed in certain parts of society, including education. They don't have physical access to it. They literally can't get to a university campus without difficulty. Or they have obligations that keep them from pursuing something like education, tertiary education. And so that's the other thing I wanted to give Peggy, not just all the usual barriers, class, gender, expectation, but I wanted to give her one of those barriers that I think anyone, particularly women, could relate to, and that's care. So care stops us from doing so many things that we might desire to do. So many women have curtailed their education or their job opportunities or their career because of children, because of care of children, and then because of care of elders. You know, it's a situation that I think a lot of people can relate to.
Yeah, I think that resonated really strongly with me, the decisions that she had to make that sort of split a person. You can go and study, but you need to leave behind this person, this responsibility you know that you have sitting there at home, even to the extent at that time where women were being asked to assist the soldiers, to volunteer, and that's a privilege to have time.
It was.
And availability. And for a working class woman who, her sister was neurodivergent.
I never, on purpose, I don't define Maud.
No.
I really wanted readers to get to know Maud on her own terms. She's seen as different and she sees the world differently. That's kind of how I describe her.
Sure.
Because I don't want anyone to bring a preconceived idea of who Maud might be, because she's not what you think she is.
No.
By the end of the book. So.
Oh, absolutely not. And I feel like that surprises Peggy as much as the reader.
Yeah. And
Which is great.
That's right. And that was deliberate as well. It's so interesting. I get so much joy out of the writing because I genuinely am curious about the things that I'm writing about. Well, I don't know that I ever fully understand, but I gather understanding as I write. And that's part of the joy for me. And writing Maud was so interesting and challenging and satisfying because I had to really think hard about what I wanted Maud to be doing in this story, which led me to thinking about what are people like Maud often doing in other stories, and realising that they often have one role, and that's to be a victim or a reason for the main character, you know, to have a story arc. And I didn't want Maud to sit there. I wanted her to be fully fleshed out and have agency of her own. And doing that was a huge challenge because she communicates differently as well. She has echolalia, which is a real thing, and it's a way of communicating these days often found mostly in children because there's therapy to to help them communicate more kind of neurotypically. But back then there wouldn't have been any therapy, and so I'm assuming she would have had these habits of speech right into adulthood. And it's something that I spoke to experts about to ensure that I got it as right as I possibly could. But her way of speaking created challenges, but also created just some amazing opportunities to demonstrate, you know, the power of communication, demonstrate what truth is, what censorship is, all these sorts of things. Yeah, I loved writing Maud.
I loved reading Maud, and I loved reading the characters that you brought in to interact with Maud and how they respected and related to her was exceptional, because I think that backed up that responsibility to the character and letting her present herself as fully as you possibly could. One is Lot. Tell us a little bit about Lot.
Oh, yeah. Lot kind of breaks my heart. Lot is a Belgian refugee, and there's two refugees who are significant characters in this book because 200 Belgian refugees arrived in Oxford very soon after the war began. And as I was writing these scenes, Russia invaded Ukraine, and, you know, I could see on my television every night people in Europe welcoming Ukrainian refugees, with open arms, with clothing, with food, with hugs. So it wasn't hard to imagine the scene in Oxford more than 100 years ago. And they were welcomed with open arms. So one of them is Lot. She is a woman who has fled Louvain. And Louvain is famous during World War I because it was razed to the ground essentially by the Germans, and they burnt the university library. Just this terrible tragedy in addition to the tragedy of these summary murders of men and boys as well in that place. So it was a really tragic location during World War I. And Bastian is a soldier, a Belgian soldier, and he's recovering from terrible injuries in hospital. And Oxford became a hospital town during World War I because the colleges essentially were emptied because so many of the students who would normally reside in them joined up as officers, which is what young men who could go to Oxford University immediately became officers. They didn't have to go in as infantry. And so the colleges were available to be used as hospitals, and they were. And so Peggy meets Bastian because she reads letters and writes letters for him. And she meets Lot because Lot comes to work in the bindery, which is something that happened. So some of these refugees did go and work at Oxford University Press, and they were taken in by other businesses as well. And Lot is important in many ways. She has a particular relationship with Maud for reasons that become apparent, which I won't talk about. She's also incredibly traumatised, and so writing about that kind of trauma was a challenge as well, because we know this, everyone reacts to trauma differently. And so my two Belgians, who have both come from the same town actually, experienced it slightly differently, but they've both experienced trauma. They both exhibit their trauma differently. They deal with it differently. I was interested in that, in how trauma might impact on a person and how it might express itself. Yeah, and so Lot just, kind of breaks my heart. But
yeah, she was a very impactful character in it all. What I loved in her relationship with Maud was her ability to give Maud autonomy and show Peggy the capacity of that.
Yes.
And just say, this lady has agency.
Yes.
You can let things go and pursue your dreams.
And I think, isn't that always the case, that you sometimes need an outsider to see clearly? And that's one of the things that Lot can do for Peggy, is look at Maud and see her slightly more clearly than Peggy can.
Another character that you actually brought across from Dictionary of Lost Words was Tilda. She's sort of the, femme fatale phenomenon.
Yeah.
That was a great friend of Peggy and Maud's mother, and then their aunt, essentially. That
turns she
up
acts like an aunt, doesn't she? Yeah.
But seeing her become so absorbed by her war experience, that journey itself is quite amazing.
Oh, thank you. Because this book crosses over time and place with the Dictionary of Lost Words. It was always going to be likely that some of the characters from the first book would walk on the pages of this book. And Tilda was one of those characters in Dictionary. I never wanted to write a book about a woman like Tilda because so many books have been written about women like Tilda. She's the suffragette, she's sexually liberated, she's outspoken, she has so much agency. She's all of those things that heroines from the past are represented as. And I wanted to write about ordinary women in many ways. But I still found her irresistible. And
how could you? She's gorgeous.
She is. And I wanted to know what would happen to a woman like Tilda during war. What would that feisty, forthright, outspoken woman be after spending a couple of years nursing broken men? And she serves two purposes in the novel. I was interested just in her story, which is why she's there, but also I needed someone that could bring the war into Peggy's life And it's a first-person narrative. So this whole novel, like the first, is told from Peggy's point of view. And because she never leaves Oxford, she couldn't really give the reader any insight into what was going on in the war. But the war is a significant kind of backdrop. And so Tilda becomes a VAD. She volunteers as a nurse and goes to France. And her letters kind of give the context of the war and fleshes out what Peggy can't contribute. I really loved writing Tilda. And I liked using that device because, in fact, letters in historical fiction are just so appropriate because that's how people communicated. They used to have 4 or 5 letter deliveries a day. That's how important. So, you know, we might use email or text now. Well, they would get just as many letters a day. And so I love using letters because it was such a part of life at that time.
Oh, it certainly felt authentic. That way of communication was the time. And so it resonated with me as just such a powerful device. And like everything, the stories of women put front and centre. We do hear Bastian's experience as a man who's gone through the war and his recovery and what is going on with him, but to hear the war from the perspective of a woman, and such a unusual woman to be thrown into that situation was so enlightening and engrossing in terms of its arcs that just got you captivated.
Oh, good.
So
Thank you.
Loved it. Peggy's sort of reluctant in so many ways to dive into this world. It's what she's always wanted.
Yeah.
Weirdly, she gets to step across the threshold to Somerville first as the volunteer in a medical setting.
Yes, because Somerville became one of those hospitals. And so the first time she goes into Somerville is as a volunteer.
Dreaming of learning there, and then, you know, finally across the threshold in that manner. It just, you know, you're just going, oh, come on, Peggy, you can do it.
Yeah.
I won't give anything away, but something in her experience in terms of her access to learning even then shows you that when you can learn and when you have the ambition and when you have the drive, there is so much, particularly at that time, to do with your upbringing that defines whether you can or you can't. I mean, and that resonates to what you were saying before about people who have access to knowledge and access to university and access to these opportunities. So much of it is defined, isn't it, in life experience, whether you like it or not, whether the door opens or not.
Yep, and whether your parents expect that you do it, whether your community expects that you do it. And I think, you know, historical fiction aside and this story aside, I think all of us probably have examples of when we say to ourselves, I really want to do this, but our biggest saboteur is ourselves. And I mean, that was my experience with writing. You know, the only person stopping me from writing early on was me. It wasn't anybody else. I found excuses not to write. And I think that's a typical experience of a lot of people who have big dreams. And it's certainly Peggy's experience. Even when doors are metaphorically opened for her, she is finding a way to undermine herself, which I think is authentic. I think we do that, particularly if we have been told our whole lives that we can't do something.
Yes, even with a dream and ambition, it is so easy to let negative talk get in the way and just snuff out that dream, isn't it?
Yeah, and sometimes it's much easier to dream than to strive. Yeah, it is, because the dream is untainted. Weirdly, that's what I essentially was writing about in my memoir, One Italian Summer, because that was all about living the good life, which was a dream. As soon as we tried to do it, we realised that the dream is this untainted image. It's a mirage. And the closer you get, the grubbier it gets.
Well, there's always work.
Exactly. Exactly. And when we dream something, though, it's never hard work. It's just it just comes so easily in the dream. And so once you step towards it, you realise there's a headwind, essentially, and you have to really work hard against the headwind to get where you want to go.
Now, you've written the stories of discovering the power of words. You've written a story about accessing knowledge. Surely you got something cooking up now.
I actually have no shortage of ideas. And at the moment I have 3 strong contenders. And I think I will write all of them eventually. But at the moment, there's probably 2 that are vying for my attention right now. One of them would be familiar with some of the characters in these 2 books.
So one of them sits in a similar world
Similar.
or time.
Yes. The other one, not. It's completely different. It's set in Australia and it's far more contemporary. And it's actually a story that I've sat with for longer than the Dictionary of Lost Words, and it hasn't gone away. So it's one I'd really like to write. And then the other one is much more of a companion to these 2 books. But again, it would require a lot of research, and I think I need a little bit of a break from the intensity of that kind of research. But it's lovely not having any shortage of ideas. And what happens is for all 3 of these stories, they've all got their own notebook, and ideas just pop into my head all the time, and they get put in the appropriate notebook for the day that I'm ready to sit down and attend to it. So they'll keep me going for quite a few years.
Well, that's a relief, because it'll be nice to know that we either revisit the characters and have more companions, or we find something new. But either way, it's reassuring to know you've got these gems out there, Pip. Thank you for giving me your time today.
Oh, you're so welcome, Sarah. It was lovely to meet you.
You too, thanks. Pip Williams there, author of The Dictionary of Lost Words and The Bookbinder of Jericho, and from the sounds of it, with plenty more great reading to come. It was just wonderful to have that time to talk with Pip, not just about the books and her characters, but also about process. I'm always fascinated about what makes an author tick and inspires them, and how they make it fit into their world. That's all I've got time for in this mini-sode. I hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll be back with a regular episode soon. I'm Sarah Martin. Have a great day.
Hi, Jeremy Cordeaux in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycordeaux.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.